for War Legacies in the Vietnam War Era. We are waiting for our meeting room to populate, and so please hold for 2 minutes, and then we'll begin our webinar. Again, welcome everyone. We're looking forward to a lively discussion, a productive discussion. We have over 260 RSVPs for today's event, which is a very impressive number. And it takes a while for all of you to populate the public webinar room. So we'll get started in about a minute whenever that begins. And with well over 150 people in the room, why don't we get started? Welcome everyone. Again, my name is Brian Eiler. I'm the chair of the War Legacies Working Group at the Stimson Center. And I'm about to tell you all about the War Legacies Working Group. But today we're here to learn more and explore ways that the United States Congress and executive agencies can work together to help those victims of the Vietnam War fully recover. We're going to be looking deeply at the legacies of the Vietnam War era, which impacted people not just in Vietnam, but also in the extended theater of war in Laos and Cambodia, and importantly, still has its victims carrying on here in the United States through veterans and their children. This is an excellent opportunity now that we are moving into 2021 to explore new ways that more resources can be plowed toward recovery from these legacies issues. And we reached out to the Congressional Unexploded Ordnance and Demining Caucus, to Representative Congresswoman Jackie Speer from the 14th District of California. And we're very delighted to welcome her and a panel of many others that are active in this space to meet with us today. Very quickly about the War Legacies Working Group. We are a membership organization, and I want to show you who our members are by sharing a slide here. There are 14 members of our organization, and they are displayed here on this slide. And we're really proud that we all work together in a common spirit to overcome these horrible legacies of war related to demining, Agent Orange or dioxin, as well as unexploded ordnance. And these legacies are still playing out in the countries that I mentioned previously. We're also supported by a number of individuals that are active within this space. And we get together every 6 weeks to share knowledge, share best practices, and find ways to, again, drive the needle forward on this issue. We're united in spirit and through the knowledge that these are very solvable issues, that it just takes the manpower, the will, and the resources to close the books on these issues once and for all. And we're also united by knowing that our work in these issue areas will build bridges to countries in Asia, to stakeholders in Asia, particularly to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and really show the positive and constructive side of America's foreign policy and the goodwill of Americans in this important space. Over the last year, we've held several events. Many of them have revolved around books, and today we've invited one recent author, Matthew Bray Bolton, I'm not sure if he's going to talk about his book, but he has a recently published book, Political Minefields, and these are some of the other books that we've had talks about over the last year, noting particularly books written by Heidi Kuhn, Breaking Ground, From Enemies to Partners by Charles Bailey and Lê Quê Son, and the United States and Southeast Asia and Historical Memory, with authored chapters from Chanapa Khonsava, all of whom are now or once were members of our War Legacies Working Group. We've got a very productive slate ahead of you, and I think that importantly, our event is structured to show again that unity that is driving the War Legacies Working Group forward, and that is demonstrated not just by our ability to land such an impressive panel of speakers, including Congresswoman Jackie Spear, Tim Reeser, Dr. Matthew Bay-Brolton, and very importantly, Craig Hart, Asia Bureau Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID, but also through my co-facilitators, Sarah Gulabdara, who is the Executive Director of Legacies of War, and Kristen Stevens, who runs the Congressional Outreach for Halo Trust. And with that, I thank you for coming, and I'm going to turn the floor over to my co-facilitator, Sarah Gulabdara, to get us right into our panel.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian, for that warm introduction and for kicking us off. You're right. We have an all-star panel today. So thank you so much for Stimson Center and my friends at the War Legacies Working Group for hosting this. Now, as a child growing up in Laos, I was always taught to walk on well-worn paths to avoid stepping on bombs. Most of them look like one of this small little ball, right? Now, these are bombs that were dropped over 50 years ago, but they're still impacting the lives of people today. You know, I know, and my family knows firsthand, that these deadly war legacies issues have on human lives, and even after the war is over. So it is such an honor and a privilege to represent Legacies of War, as well as our War Legacies Working Group as your moderator today. I also want to give a special welcome to our esteemed guests, as well as all of you tuning in. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Let's get started. I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker today, Tim Reeser. So Tim is the Senior Foreign Policy Aide for Senator Patrick Leahy. Tim also serves as Democratic Clerk of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee. He graduated from the Putney School in Vermont in 1970 and received his Bachelor of History from Dorfmont College in 1976. He also earned his JD from Antioch College of Law in 1979. And from 1980 to 1983, Tim worked as a public defender in Barre, Vermont. And in 84, spent a year as a teaching assistant under Professor Roger Fisher at Harvard Law School Negotiation Project. In 1985, Tim began working for US Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont on judiciary issue, then shift to foreign policy in 1987. In 1995, Tim became the Democratic clerk for what by then was a subcommittee on the Department of State and Foreign Operations, and has held that position ever since, handling appropriations for the operations of the Department of State and US Agency for International Development and US Foreign Assistance Programs. So thank you for your dedication to public service, Tim. Our War Legacies Working Group loves partnering with you, and welcome. Next, we have Dr. Matthew Bolton. Dr. Bolton is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Pace University in the Big Apple. He is an expert on global peace and security policy, focusing on multilateral disarmament and arms control policy-making processes. He has been an active participant in global campaigns on landmines, cluster munition, killer robots, and the arms trade. Since 2014, Dr. Bolton has worked on the UN and the New York City advocacy of the International Campaign to Abolish Weapons. He's the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize and has published 5 books, including the one that my co-moderator Brian mentioned, Political Minefields. Dr. Bolton has a PhD in government and master's in development studies from the London School of Economics. He's also a member of the US Campaign to Ban Landmines, US Cluster Munition Coalition. I really don't know when he has time to sleep, so good to have you with us, Dr. Bolton. Thank you for being such a strong voice on championing these important issues. Next, we have Craig Hart. Welcome, Craig. Craig is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service and currently serves as Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Asia. Prior to joining the Bureau, he served as the USAID Deputy Mission Director in Vietnam from 2016 until 2020. Prior to this, he attended the National War College in Washington, D.C., and served in various roles for USAID in Tanzania, Afghanistan, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. Before joining USAID, Craig served with the U.S. Peace Corps from 1995 to 2005. He received a master's degree in national security strategy from the National War College, master's degree in education administration from the University of Vermont, and bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Kentucky. I wonder if you and Tim cross paths. Thank you for joining us today and for the incredible work that you have done all over the world. So with that, as I mentioned, we have such an all-star lineup. Representative Spear will be joining us later. So I'll introduce her once she's on. For now, I want to invite our guests to share some opening remarks, starting with Tim, and then Dr. Bolton, and then Craig. Tim, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks for your introduction, Brian and Sarah. I really am glad that you're doing this. And Craig, it's great to see you. Craig and I have definitely crossed paths, and I hope we will again. And Matthew, I'd like to talk to you sometime about your book, which I have not read, but I'd like to know more about it. Let me just very briefly, because we have three people, not a lot of time, and then Congresswoman Spear, give you just a little bit of history as far as how Senator Leahy and I got involved in these issues. It really goes back to 1989. And I mention that because trying to do anything that hasn't been done before takes a long time, and it takes many people, and it takes a lot of persistence. And that has certainly been the case here. Senator Leahy, back then, really in a conversation with the first President Bush, wanted to do something, as did President Bush, to try to re-engage with Vietnam. This was in 1989. And the first way that we went about doing that was to address some of the most obvious humanitarian issues. We knew that there were millions and millions of unexploded bombs and landmines, that there were countless people who had been severely disabled as a result, and were crawling on the ground as a result of having lost a limb or their eyesight. And that was really how this initiative began, was first of all trying to help people regain their mobility in Vietnam, and the same in Cambodia. And it was really the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation and Bobby Muller at the time who helped us understand the scale of the problem and ways that we could begin to engage with these countries again. And so that then really was the beginning of what became ultimately, or in the process of the last 3 decades, a multifaceted War Legacies program in these countries to address the needs of people with disabilities who suffered severe injuries during the war, to locate and get rid of unexploded bombs like the submunition that you showed from Laos, and also more recently to address the contamination and consequences caused by exposure to dioxin contaminated Agent Orange. And so these War Legacy programs have expanded over the years. It's involved many people, a lot of engagement with the Vietnamese, and more recently the government of Laos, and also the government of Cambodia, and different NGOs that implement programs. We've learned a lot in the process, but most of all, I think, in addition to improving the lives of people who were severely impacted as a result of actions of our own during the war, whether it was from exposure to Agent Orange, or from stepping on a landmine, or being injured from some other unexploded munition. We not only were able to address an issue which we felt some responsibility for, and which was a way of helping people who had been affected improve their lives, and really in many cases become productive members of society again, having been shunned and ostracized as a result of their injuries. But we also, I think in the process, as importantly, were able to build a new relationship with these countries. And it has opened up many other opportunities for us in ways that I don't think would have been possible if we hadn't started here. So I can go into a lot more detail. Craig was in Vietnam, a partner of ours, as were many others in our government, including the Department of Defense. Increasingly, they have become involved in this because they have certain capabilities, and they have obviously an interest in building relations with the government, the Ministry of Defense in Vietnam. So there's many aspects to this. I could talk a long time about it, but that's really a bit of the history. And when we go into the questions, I can perhaps address some of the things that we hope to do in the future.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that really remarkable overview and historical background on this. Dr. Bolton, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be on this panel of very senior people, including people who have been involved in this for a very long time. And so I'm very grateful to be a part of this. I first became captivated by the situation facing communities affected by landmines and cluster munitions when I lived in them myself as an aid worker in Bosnia and then in Iraq. And I began to realize that landmines and cluster munitions and other unexploded ordnance represented a kind of compelling metaphor, as well as a practical reality of how you address the violent legacies of war. And in further reporting from Laos and Cambodia, Afghanistan, Sudan, and South Sudan, I've been really inspired by the resilience of those working to end the inhumane and indiscriminate effects of automated violence, many of whom are actually the people most affected by those problems themselves. And addressing landmines and cluster munitions and other explosive remnants of war in Southeast Asia and beyond offers a way to address those ongoing consequences of armed conflict, contributing to reconciliation, to economic reconstruction, to political confidence building, to building linkages between states that were, or groups that were formerly at war or are currently at war in certain cases. Casualties continue to occur across something akin to 50 countries and territories around the world that are affected by mines and cluster munitions. But this is not a problem that will last forever if we make an effort to address it. We've seen in lots of places that the efforts of groups on the ground, like the Halo Trust, who's represented on the panel here today, can make a significant dent in contamination if they're given the resources to do that. And we also see that even if casualty rates can be brought down, there are still people who are living with the disabilities that were caused by their injuries. And so we have a duty of care to help. And so it is somewhat unnerving that overall, globally, support for foreign assistance to address landmines and cluster munitions is reducing in its dollar amounts. That said, the story in Southeast Asia is a little bit more optimistic. There has been a concerted, significant effort, particularly by the US government, with support from people in different parties and different branches of the government and different parts of society to make an effort to try to address the ongoing consequences of the conflicts that date back to the 1960s and maybe even before in some cases. I wanted to say briefly a little bit about what makes that happen, what makes that difference come about. And I think it's that we really have to pay tribute to the efforts of investigative reporters and the news media in bringing, for instance, the story of the secret war in Laos to the attention of the American public and to Congress in the 1970s, as well as the role of activists and advocates outside of government in drawing political attention to the ongoing bombing campaign that was happening in Laos and Cambodia. But also to recognize the role of Congress in finally bringing that to the public. There were hearings in Congress that drew the attention of the news media and the American public to what was happening. And while that was happening here in the United States, there was also efforts in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam as well. People who were displaced by the bombing themselves made efforts to try and make contact with people who could tell their story. And so we shouldn't underestimate the kind of agency and capacity of affected communities to be heard. And they were helped in many ways by people, aid workers, Quakers, and Mennonites who were working on the ground in those regions to try to tell those stories and start seeking ways to address them. Their voices were heard by people, pioneering voices on the Hill, like Senator Leahy, who really, I have been truly impressed from a distance by the kind of quality of attention over a very long period of time to this issue of making sure that it doesn't disappear. And I just wanted to end my remarks by just kind of calling attention to the ongoing efforts of people to make sure that we hear the voices of the people who are most affected, including from the Plain of Jars in Laos, that the role of Legacies of War, which I was supposed to show my book earlier, Sarah told me to, but in chapter 2 of my book, I talk about their role in bringing together a bipartisan kind of consensus on the Hill that this needed to be addressed. And I also wanted to point out that aid is crucial, important, and can be separated from other political disagreements we might have about the role of the government, the role of landmines and cluster munitions, the role of the military. All those things can be set aside to some degree with focusing on the humanitarian needs of the people in Southeast Asia and the role that the US government can play. That said, in setting some of those things aside, we still need to address some of them. And I really think that it's crucial that we recognize the role of campaigns, advocacy campaigns in the US campaign to ban landmines, the US campaign against cluster munitions, and that the US still has not joined the treaties banning landmines and cluster munitions, and that those have been championed by people in Congress from various different political standpoints. And it really, at this moment where we are seeing a shift in US politics, might be a time to return to this question of making sure that the US does the right thing on landmines and cluster munitions, right thing in the humanitarian sense and also in a security sense, because neither of these weapons provide any significant strategic benefit to the US military. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Bolton. So you just gave us this long list of things for all of us here to work on. But I do want to just thank you for bringing up survivors. Very, very important. It's something that, as a working group, we talk about consistently, as well as the role of the media, right? Like our media partners can really, really help champion this. I just want to take a moment to also remind our audience, which I believe we have about 200 now signed on, to please type in your questions. It could be just a question for anyone in the panel or a specific person. So we encourage you to keep doing that because we will have time to answer some of them. So with that, I want to invite Craig to give some opening remarks. Craig, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Sarah and Brian. Thank you, Stimson Center, for hosting today's important discussion. Really important. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to join Dr. Bolton, Mr. Reeser, and Representative Spear in this esteemed panel. And as many of you probably know, USAID has a longstanding commitment to addressing the legacies of the Vietnam War. While our colleagues in the State Department focus on UXO and demining, USAID actually works to assist people with disabilities and clean up sites contaminated by Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I'll be focusing on USAID's disabilities work in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So USAID has an enduring commitment to disability inclusive development across all sectors of our work, and that is critical. We're not just, I might be reviewing some of the programs that we're engaged in today, but it's really across the entire breadth of our programming that we're focusing on this. So we recognize that when we promote the human rights of persons with disabilities and support their empowerment, that we are advancing inclusion, equity, and sustainability for all. And these persons must be able to benefit from and contribute meaningfully to, as Tim mentioned, their country's journey to self-reliance. That contribution to and recognizing that, I think, is really important. USAID's disabilities assistance in Southeast Asia has been possible due to the strong support of members of Congress and their staff, in particular Senator Patrick Leahy and Tim Reeser. Tim is very modest when he references his role in things, and Senator Leahy's. His knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge of everything that has happened around this issue is truly impressive. So our sincere thanks go out to them for their long years of leadership and championing these causes and continuously advocating for US government action, particularly since the creation of the Leahy War Victims Fund in 1989. Since the establishment of USAID's Leahy War Victims Fund, USAID has worked to increase access to a wide variety of programs benefiting people with disabilities in conflict-affected areas. So let me get into some specifics. In Vietnam, for example, where I've just returned this past summer after 4 wonderful years of being able to work with folks there. Disabilities projects in Vietnam have evolved over time from really kind of providing prosthetic devices and rehab services to building a system that provides essential services and supports the self-reliance of people with disabilities, advancing disabilities policies and regulations, and strengthening advocacy for rights and inclusion. It has been our local partners, as well as our international partners, who have come together and been instrumental in achieving these goals, as we've worked together with them to strengthen their management and implementation capacity while carrying out these projects as well for our local partners in particular. So USAID's focused on providing services for persons with severe disabilities in provinces heavily sprayed with Agent Orange, and our assistance includes such things as early childhood intervention to detect disabilities and identify needed therapies, building Vietnam's rehabilitation system to provide speech, occupational, and physical therapies, establishing national guidelines for education programs, and working with Vietnam to build a system of social support at the community level to truly look at that sustainability factor. Our long-standing support has also been instrumental in expanding the healthcare coverage, which has been really critical under Vietnam's national healthcare insurance plan to include disabilities coverage. So specifically, USAID and our partners have come together, and our work has basically resulted in an expansion of rehab services covered by national insurance from 33 to 265 services that support persons with disabilities, again, speaking to the sustainability of the approach. So this work contributes, I think, very much to the country's efforts to overcome the past, to build trust, to strengthen bilateral relations. And the foundational work has promoted a stronger security relationship between the US and Vietnam, and it's also really opened doors to new cooperation. In Laos, persons with disabilities are one of the most highly marginalized population. In 2019, we launched the program to enhance the economic independence and functional ability of persons with disabilities through the promotion of equal access to health and social services. We are now training health and rehabilitation service providers, supporting health centers to provide assistive products at the local level, and promoting rehabilitation as a standard part of healthcare treatment overall. We're also very much engaged in a variety of public and private partners, bringing different folks to the table to implement inclusive vocational training courses, to integrate persons with disabilities into the labor force and provide market-based livelihood opportunities as well. So we want to thank our partners in that regard as well. We're also partnering with Allow government and civil society to develop and implement disability inclusive policies and advance the rights of persons with disabilities. And then finally, in Cambodia, USAID has a long history of enhancing the care of persons with disabilities in Cambodia, including victims of torture under the Khmer Rouge. Since the 1990s, our support has included the provision of prosthetics, orthotics, and assistance for 3 regional rehab centers. As a result, USAID's of our support, we just over 2 years ago, the Cambodian government was able to assume full financial responsibility for the management and operation of these 3 rehab centers, which we are very proud of, and working with them and their leadership. USAID is also supporting early monitoring and screening for children in 3 provinces to detect developmental delays and disabilities for early intervention, which is critical. Our inclusive education work has also adapted early grade reading materials into Braille and videos into Cambodian Sign Language for students with hearing and vision impairments. So USAID developed reading programs that promotes learning outcomes for children and with and without disabilities has actually resulted in about a 16% improvement on foundational literacy in its first year. So we're excited about that as well. So let me wrap up by saying thank you very much again to Senator Leahy and Tim for their leadership of the legacy of war issues, as well as to the Stimson Center for the scholarship and advocacies on these issues. Thank you very much, and back over to you.
Thank you so much, Craig. We'll definitely come back to a lot of the things that you just covered, but I want to shift a little bit over and welcome our final speaker for today, Representative Jackie Spears. Thank you so much for joining us. You really don't need any introduction, but I like to just share with our audience just briefly before I pass the mic over to you. So Representative Jackie Spears of California is a fearless fighter for women's equality, LGBTQ rights, and the disenfranchised, who has dedicated her life to eliminating government corruption while working to strengthen America's national and economic security. She was named to Newsweek's list of 100 fearless women in the world and one of Political's top 50 most influential people in American politics for bringing the Me Too reckoning to Congress. She co-found and co-chairs the Congressional Unexploded Ordnance and Demining Caucus, which we are also thankful exists. Representative Spear, thank you so much for being our voice on these deadly war legacies issue, and a big welcome to you. So I know we have a limited amount of time, so I do want to ask you to just please, give us a little bit of some opening remarks, and I'll put you in the hot seat and ask you just 2 questions, I promise.
Okay, all right, okay. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining in this important conference. A special thank you to all of you who have been in the trenches on this issue for so very long. I want to thank the panelists who, unfortunately, I didn't get to hear all of you, but Tim Reiser, Dr. Matthew Bolton, I did hear Craig Hart, Kristen Stevens, and of course, Sarah. Let me just say at the outset how important I think the work that you are doing is. I was frankly pretty ignorant about UXO and demining generally until I made a trip to Laos in 2018. And after shamefully recognizing how much damage we have done for so many decades now, and we have never cleaned up our mess, I became passionate about this issue. And it was as a result of that trip that I started, along with my colleague, the UXO Demining Caucus. And I think we've had some great wins in the last couple of years, due in no small part to all of you who have joined with us in this effort. I did lead a bipartisan letter to, along with many of my other colleagues, to make sure that we properly fund the efforts. And we had 65 members who joined in that letter, which is a lot, believe it or not, in Congress when there's so many competing letters that are being sent out on a regular basis. But the letter it requires us to increase funding for U.S. landmine removal efforts. And as a result, the appropriation bill passed by both chambers only a few weeks ago includes $6 million overall increase to the State Department's conventional weapons account and $40 million for demining activities in Laos. That's a $2.5 million increase over fiscal year 20. It's also heartening to see continued support for the $17 million for Vietnam and $7 million for Cambodia. But having said all that, it's not enough. And our work isn't complete there. And it's truly shameful that we have not cleaned up the mess that we created. Knowing that the Vietnam War is now 40 years old, it's estimated that 1/5 of the land in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam remains contaminated by UXOs. It really hurts me to even have to say that to you, but it's true. And as our panelists noted, the US bears responsibility for much of this contamination, having dropped millions of tons of bombs on the region throughout the Vietnam era. And probably the most disturbing of all is that those who are victimized, 54% of all the civilian injuries and or deaths are happening to children. So I have been working with USAID in an effort to increase their support for demining over the last few years, not with a great deal of success. I was also attempting to do it in Nagorno-Karabakh, but I think with a new director, someone who is passionate about human rights, who recognizes full well the black eye that we continue to have as it relates to this issue, I think we're going to make some big strides. So I'm not happy with the levels that we're at. And I think our obligation to clean it up once and for all is something that we need to make a high priority. So with that, Sarah, I'll conclude my remarks and thank you and the Legacy of War Group and Stimson Center for hosting this, because we have much more work to do.
Thank you so much, Rep. Spear. And you said it well, and I think I'm going to put this on a tote bag. It is not enough. There's so much more to be done, right? Which is a great segue into my first question for you. So what are some of the top priorities and upcoming events of the UXO caucus, and how can other representatives join and make an impact?
I can't implore you enough to seek out your local member of Congress to join the caucus. When we get that kind of input from our districts, we're much more inclined to join these caucuses. And the UXO Demining Caucus in particular has been active. We've joined with many of the groups in co-hosting events. And I think it's very important to spread the knowledge base, because the more members that know about it, the more members that realize what a lousy job we've done so far, the more likely we are to be able to rid the world of the dangerous bombs that we exploded on other people's land. So we want to increase the numbers of members. So I urge you to contact your local member of Congress and urge them to do so. We're going to push for the passage of the Legacies of War Recognition and the UXO Removal Act. We want more funding. And I'd be interested in hearing from you as to what more you think we should be doing. We don't have all the answers for sure, but the plan to rid Laos of its bombs was supposed to be completed, and it's still not completed. That was a commitment that President Obama had made. So I'm certain with President Biden at the helm that he's going to recognize that this is a promise we haven't fully kept, and we need to do that.
No, and we're so lucky to have you going to bat for us. So thank you. And our team, as well as Kristen, Jamie, and a couple of my colleagues, would definitely be knocking at your door here soon to brainstorm, right? But my second question is ties right in with members of Congress. So there's many congressional offices that are generally supportive of global UXO removal programs, but find it difficult to prioritize support for these programs given the wide range of important issues that they need to address, many of which are directly impact their constituencies at home. So how would you convince those offices to make addressing war legacy issues a priority?
The best way to do it is to have their constituents contact them about it. We get lots of letters as members of Congress, and they're always imploring us to support one bill or another. And it becomes pretty compelling when you have a large number of constituents who want you to co-author a specific bill or resolution. So that is persuasion, and you're being persuasive when you do that. So I urge again that you do that and ask your family and friends around the country to do it as well, because that's how we gain momentum.
Thank you so much. And, we are going to follow your advice right now, because my colleague Kristen will be dropping a link to everyone here to send a letter to their members of Congress to really join in and support Representative Speer to be part of the UXO and demining caucus. So thank you so much again for making time to be with us. I know these days Congress is a little bit busy, so we appreciate you. I'll go ahead and have Tim be on the hot seat next and ask him his first question. So Tim, with your support in recent years, we have seen considerable funding increase for the removal of US legacy ordnance, especially in Southeast Asia. Yet, you heard Representative Speer say, it is still not enough. We're not fulfilling our promise. There is still an enormous amount of work to be done. What can we do to ensure that there's room for additional growth in the coming years?
Thank you. Let me just say that it is true, we have a long way to go. But I would also say that, I don't know another country that's ever done what we are doing as a result of having created a problem like this during a war. Senator Leahy and I lived through that period, and it was a catastrophe for both countries. And most governments just walk away and treat these types of issues as just a fact of war that people have to accept. And I think the fact that we have not done that, albeit it took a while and we have a long way to go, speaks well of the United States and certainly of USAID, which has been absolutely instrumental in implementing these programs. Our embassy, through successive ambassadors, have been very instrumental advocates for this. And the Department of Defense, as I mentioned earlier. So, we recognize that the task is really daunting. And in the case of Agent Orange, for example, the Vietnamese government initially was very angry about this, very resentful about it for obvious reasons. It was an issue of real antagonism between us. Because they felt that we have a responsibility to address it, and we agreed with that. The question was how to go about it, because they were telling us the entire country was contaminated, which was just more than anyone could imagine knowing how to deal with. But over time, we were able to determine that actually that wasn't the case. It was limited to mostly former US air bases, where there was some severe contamination in Da Nang and Bien Hoa and a few other places. And of course, areas that were heavily sprayed, where there were people who had suffered severe disabilities, and their children and even their grandchildren. So it was a continuing problem. And we began with one province. We've now expanded to 8 provinces. We envision expanding to 10 provinces, where we have now, thanks to USAID, health and disability programs. It's not easy to do. It involves convincing local officials who are sometimes supportive and sometimes not. There are issues of the capacity of local organizations, which is quite limited in Vietnam. So we've had to use US organizations and provide training and build that capacity. But over time, we've expanded each year, and the amount of funding has increased. And in the case of dealing with the dioxin contamination, it cost about $135 million to clean up just Da Nang alone. We are going to be spending at least $300 million and perhaps more to help clean up the Bien Hoa Air Base. And there are others. And in terms of the health disabilities programs and the UXO programs, obviously a lot more. But as in the case of Laos, we've incrementally worked our way up. We're now at $40 million. President Obama was really helpful in focusing on this issue, and that helped us increase the amount that we were able to get support for. But I think that, going forward, there's broad support in the Congress. It's really a matter of competing priorities. We never have enough, as Representative Spear knows better than anybody. We're always having to make choices about what we can fund. And also, to some extent, it's a question of how well we can spend the funds that we have. We think we have a good project going in Bien Hoa. We have good programs going in these various provinces. In Laos, the funds now we have, it's just a matter of training new demining teams. And the more that we can train, the more funds we can provide. So, I think we've learned a lot over the years. I think that it's now just a question of, with the support of the administration, which I think we will have because of some of the new leadership that we see coming in. I'm pretty optimistic. Again, we have a lot of competing priorities, but this is one that we feel, Senator Leahy has felt literally for 30 years, that we have a moral responsibility to address, and that it's a critical part of our relationship with Vietnam and the reconciliation that has been possible with that country, to the point where now issues like Agent Orange, which were such a source of, I had so many difficult meetings when this issue was brought up. Now it's a subject of real appreciation and cooperation, and really has, I think, become a model for what's possible.
Excellent, thank you. So next up, I want to turn over to Dr. Bolton. Dr. Bolton, one of my favorite quotes in your book, chapter 2, in your book, Political Minefields, is from Legacies founder, Janapa Kamungsa, in reference to the UXO issue in Laos. So the quote is, "There's many, many problems in the world that might not be solved in our lifetime, but this is one that can be fixed." Do you agree with this statement? What would have to happen in order for us to solve this issue and within our lifetime?
Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree with it. And I think in many ways I suppose if I were to be technical, I would disagree, because I think most of our problems that we ourselves have caused, we can ourselves address, even the complicated ones. But I think the spirit with which she was making her comment was that this is a problem compared with some of the many very complex issues that the US government has to face, and the Vietnamese and Cambodian and Lao governments have to face, like climate change, for example, and the security problems in Southeast Asia. This is a relatively straightforward one to address, which is not to say the other ones shouldn't be. I think what we have seen makes a difference is creating a strong normative pressure to pay attention to and listen to the people most affected. As Mr. Hart was talking about, putting people with disabilities at the center of the conversation and amplifying their voices, and taking them seriously as human beings with rights that we need to pay attention to. And then through that kind of normative framing to make sure that we make sure that there are resources there to assist. And so building the political pressure, as Representative Spear was saying, at actually relatively grassroots level, talking to elected officials and saying, this is something we want to do, creates for them the capacity to then take a stand in the halls of power to say, this is something we need to address. And then I think one of the things that Tim Reeser said that I think is really crucial is that to see this as not an infinite problem. Right, he was talking about Agent Orange and dioxin, but similarly with cluster munitions, explosive remnants of war, and landmines, the careful, what demining agencies call both non-technical and technical survey, focusing down on what areas are actually contaminated so that you don't spend a lot of money and effort clearing areas of land that are already fine. And that requires a presence on the ground, a careful attention to detail, and the kind of forensic quality of establishing what happened in that area, who was involved in the conflict in that area, taking time to survey and know what's happening. And one of the things I think is really exciting in the field of demining is those techniques in survey are getting better and better. And so we are wasting less money in the demining process than perhaps we did before. And so yes, political normative focus on the people most affected, political pressure to generate resources, and careful use of survey.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Bolton. And okay, so she got out of that one. I was going to ask her a question. But we knew we only had a limited amount of time. So Craig, you're on the hot seat. While in Laos, my team at Legacies of War and I had the opportunity to meet with a UXO survivor. His name is Kak, and Kak was only 21 years old when the accident happened, leaving him without half of his arms. Now, there's many survivors like Kak all over the world who depend on assistance in order to thrive in their new normal. This particular example is in Laos, where due to limited resources, which we've been speaking about during this whole event, help is typically not ongoing, and it only really addresses the physical aspect. Can you give us examples of initiatives or programs that USAID has implemented for survivors of UXO or other remnants of war that take this assistance a step further, perhaps, to really foster independence for survivors?
Thank you, Sarah. I feel the definite need to clarify one point before I get into that question, which is that credit needs to be given where credit is due. And so it's the Department of State, actually, who is responsible for UXO removal. The Department of State's Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement. So we want to give them full credit for doing that. Actually, USAID nowhere in the world actually engages on UXO removal. And my participation here today really is focusing in on the other aspects of this. Tim mentioned the Agent Orange cleanup that we've done and are doing in Vietnam, but more importantly, the persons with disabilities and those programs. That's really where I'm coming from this discussion today. So let me focus in on that aspect and give Department of State their due credit in terms of UXO removal. So I hear you in terms of the visit that you've had, and I've had several visits to wonderfully kind families in Vietnam who are willing to open their homes and just have a good discussion with the community. And I think that's a really important part of it. And Tim mentioned this as well, is that it has to be a person-centered kind of engagement, figuring out what that individual needs, but also figuring it out in terms of how does the community come around that person. That's a really critical part of having a more sustainable solution set. And so one of the things that we've done, and based on the leadership that's already been discussed, is we've been given the resources to be able to put the pieces together. And so as we engage with the individual and the family, understanding what is needed in terms of trained personnel has actually driven us into developing master's degree programs in Vietnam for occupational therapy, for physical therapy. And so being able to train folks up so that they are part of the overall solution set has been a really critical part of things. And being able to look just beyond the physical therapy, we also have the third degree is speech therapy. And so those solution sets have become something that are part and parcel now, not only addressing people with disabilities, but the larger population. And they're around to stay. And they're around to stay for a few reasons. One I mentioned earlier is that we were able to help the government of Vietnam in terms of sustainability implement several or many different coverage sets for people with disability that are in the overall national social health insurance scheme. And so again, that's another step in the right direction so that when people have a need, one, they can go to a hospital, have those types of services covered by national health insurance, and also be provided by people who have been recently trained by a variety of experts. And so it's that connecting of the dots to create a more supportive environment for the solution set that I think we're shooting for. That's been growing and growing with Representative Spears' help, with Tim's help, with other people's help. It will continue to grow. And we really do try to find that balance between direct service delivery, which we definitely do through our partners, and also building the overall sustainability of the system. Thank you.
Sarah, I could give just one example also of that, because I think it's really important. Senator Leahy has always felt it's not enough to just help people regain their mobility. They need to be able to support themselves and their families. And I've seen many people with very, very severe disabilities in all three countries in Southeast Asia, people who will never be able to take care of themselves. Some so disabled from birth that they will never be able to even sit in a chair. But once I was in Cambodia and with a representative of the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, and we flew to a very small remote village up in the north. And there was a program that USAID was funding that essentially provided not just artificial limbs for women who had been injured from landmines and other unexploded bombs, but also a way to make a living. And after they had been injured, they were ostracized. Nobody was interested in marrying them. And this program provided them with artificial limbs so that they could walk around and weren't dependent on somebody, but also they became very skilled weavers and were producing silk garments, which were then being sold in the United States. And very quickly, they became the wealthiest people in the community, and everyone wanted to marry them. So, it was an example of both addressing the immediate issue, which was the fact that they couldn't walk, they couldn't function, they were totally dependent, and they were shunned by people who wanted nothing to do with them, but also helping them support themselves and their families and quickly become appreciated members of their community. The vision that we have, and also what USAID has been trying to do in terms of creating that long-term community benefit from all of this.
Thank you so much, Tim. That's it gives us this it's inspiring, right? Like to hear these stories. And I think with all of us here, as well as our audience, we can definitely increase the amount of funding that goes into programs such as these and focus. So I do want to stay with you for a moment here, Tim, and ask you one more question. So what opportunities, as it relates to War Legacies issues, do you anticipate from the new Congress and the new administration? Or what do you want to see?
I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, I think certainly if Samantha Power becomes the new administrator at USAID, we will have a very strong ally. She was indispensable in our work that Senator Leahy's been pursuing for 20 years to move the United States closer to landmines, and that is an ongoing priority for him. Governments, U.S. government agencies, NGOs, everybody under the sun who has an interest in the budget that we have available, and it's never remotely enough. But I think that because this is a priority of Senator Leahy's, he's the new chairman of the Senate.
Tim, are you there? I think we're having some audio issues. Yeah, I think Tim is dealing with a little bit of technical difficulties, but I do just want to, for the sake of time, pass it over to my colleague Kristen. But before I do that, I do want to give her a little bit of an introduction. So Kristen joined Halo Trust in 2017 while finishing her master's in public administration at American University in our nation's capital. Drawing from a background in politics and nonprofit sector, Kristen leads Halo's advocacy and public policy engagement in the US as head of congressional affairs. She has been instrumental in increasing support for the UXO and demining caucus. And during Kristen's time with Halo, US funding for the demining sector has increased to more than 45 million. The Halo Trust conducts humanitarian demining in over 25 countries and territories worldwide, including Laos and Cambodia. So Kristen will be taking some audience Q&A, so you all still have time to type in your questions. Kristen, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much. So lots of questions have been pouring in over, the course of the last hour. Please keep the questions coming. So let's take some time to address a few of the questions that have come in recently. And hopefully if Tim is able to rejoin, we'll direct some to him as well as we close out this event. So a question for Craig from our colleague Charles Bailey. He says, thank you for your overview of USAID's work. USAID has accomplished a lot. However, the majority of those who have been affected by Agent Orange have not yet been reached. Congress has appropriated $14.5 million this year. What needs to happen before the U.S. can make a greater commitment of humanitarian assistance to the several 100,000 Agent Orange victims in Vietnam to, say, double the current annual allocation? And perhaps, that question is a bit more, perhaps congressionally directed, but also in terms of the administrative programmatic reach. What are maybe some areas for potential progress?
Thank you for the question. And Charles Bailey is, of course, a great contributor to this discussion and these efforts and getting more attention on this topic. So I thank Charles very much. So the question is actually already partly discussed by Tim's answer. He mentioned that we are currently in Vietnam, for instance, in 8 provinces. We're looking to expand. I think Tim and his colleagues have made it very clear to us a couple of things. One, that there is this interest in expansion. And two, that to the degree possible, we really do need to work with local organizations. And that has been our experience as well, that has been extremely effective to be able to do that. Working with local organizations who are able to develop, for instance, locally designed and manufactured solutions for greater mobility. It just blows you away, right? What they're able to do, and being responsive to the individual needs and being able to design some different mobilization kind of structures, if you will, the bed that folds into the chair and back again, to be able to assist both family members in terms of the burden on them, but also increase mobility. So working with local NGOs, in addition to being very connected to their communities, which is a really important part as well that Tim mentioned, in terms of raising the bar of expectation, we're not just looking to get people mobile, we're looking to get them engaged. We're looking to support their desire to become contributing members within their communities. And so working with them has been really important. If you try to push that too fast and too much, there are negative consequences that can happen with the NGOs that we're working with. So we want to be responsible in terms of making sure that we are every step of the way supporting those local NGOs to increase their management and oversight abilities as they implement these programs. And so we really have been pushing the envelope quite significantly in terms of doing that. I think that being cautious about that and not kind of overloading their capacity is quite important, actually, because that can have negative consequences. I think the other piece is that we are building out a system, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of being able to connect a lot of these dots. We want to build a system that is self-reliant eventually, because we have the health insurance scheme that now covers so many more cases. We have increasingly, with every year and every step, more master's degree students that are being placed then at hospitals. And those courses are very valuable to them. And being well compensated, and so the desire to get into those courses is very high as well. So I think it is building out very steadily. We also need local support to be able to engage in the individual regions, and so that is an ongoing conversation. So I think all of those pieces coming together is what needs to happen. And my experience is that we have been pushing the envelope quite significantly on those areas. And so that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response. Perhaps the last question that we have time for before some closing remarks for Matthew. Our colleague Tan Vu at the Embassy of Vietnam wants to know, on the part of the government of Vietnam and the National Assembly of Vietnam, what should be done and further promoted in relations with the US Congress to promote the understanding here about war legacy issues in Congress, thereby facilitating more assistance for war victims? Maybe drawing on all of your advocacy expertise, perhaps you have some suggestions.
Sure. I will say I'm not an expert on Congress or on US Vietnamese relations. So I would humbly submit that perhaps the diplomatic officials that are involved probably know more about it than me. I think, though, that there is a whatever the kind of ongoing issues of the relationship between the United States and Vietnam, the positives and the negatives, the challenges and opportunities, this is an area where there can be significant progress in confidence building between the US and Vietnam, but also more broadly within the region of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand too. that there are opportunities for sharing information and techniques and best practices across the region that can help to make it not just, I think there was another question in the box that it was asking about, is this a US-Vietnam issue or is it a broader kind of regional?
So, and certainly if you want to speak to more broad engagement as well.
Yeah, I think that seeing this as a broader regional kind of concern, and I think there is perhaps something that can be done is this broader question of being a part of the ensuring that people who are most affected by the issue are part of the conversation, and that the human rights of people who are living in those communities and are living with disabilities are respected and engaged with. So I think those would be my kind of core comments, knowing not the details of the relationship between the US and Vietnam. But I think also finally, this is the treaties on landmines and cluster munitions are crucial tools. They're not the only tools that we have. They are, Vietnam is also not a state party to the landmine ban, and perhaps should also join. I would humbly put that to both the US and Vietnam.
Thank you very much. And perhaps just one more question here, and this is just to the panel broadly. As we think about the lessons of the Vietnam War, do the panelists see any lessons learned from how we fought that war being taken into account and how we engage in conflict today and how we need to deal with the long-term impacts of current conflicts? Open to either of you.
Well, thank you for that huge question, if I might add. I think as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, I actually started about my international career as a Peace Corps volunteer. Peace being a significant part of that, and that I actually spent 10 years in the former Soviet space, not just as a volunteer but also as a staff member and as a director. Looking at some of those efforts and the place I actually started in was in Russia in 1995, and thinking about where we were with Russia in 1990, for example, you never would have imagined the window of opportunity that came open in 1995. For Peace Corps to be able to open, I think they opened in 93, for able to get volunteers in there, to have real contact between real people, not just government to government. And that was absolutely huge. Post-Cold War, to be able to take advantage of that opportunity, I will never forget that. And I will never forget the appreciation of the people who opened their houses to me and taught me the language and taught me the culture. The same is absolutely true as well with a much more progressed relationship in terms of Vietnam. Everyone who has been to Vietnam, especially those veterans, US veterans who I've spoken with, are just taken aback by how welcoming, how hospitable, how interested people are in that area of the world. Same thing with Cambodia and Laos as well. In terms of being able to, open homes and have person-to-person contact to understand what's going on and what these other people across the lake are thinking. And I think that's a really critical part of it. As Tim said as well, when I originally arrived in Vietnam, we had not yet begun the Bien Hoa cleanup of Agent Orange. Doing that has been a significant move forward. We were very pleased that we were able to complete the cleanup of Da Nang, which was a several-year process, about 6 or 7 years that took. And then now that we have started on the cleanup of Bien Hoa as well, that is a very concrete action that has been appreciated by all levels, both the government, the people of Vietnam. It is very very concrete in terms of being able to illustrate commitments to a long-term relationship. And I think that that has opened doors, as has the disabilities programs. And I think that, per Charles Bailey's questions as well, I think that maybe that's not going as fast as some people might like. But at the same time, it really is pushing boundaries, and we really have expedited a number of these programs and grown them quite rapidly. So having that perspective of a few decades in terms of where we are now versus where we've been, I think is really a wonderful thing that Tim and others and Charles and others bring to the picture.
Thank you so much. And before we close, would love to get Tim's insight on this question as well. So we were just discussing lessons learned from the Vietnam War and how we may or may not have taken these lessons to heart in terms of how we engage in conflict and deal with the long-term impacts of conflict today. Do you have any perhaps closing remarks on that question?
That is a big question to take on in the last minute here. I wish we had learned more of the lessons of Vietnam. I don't think we learned the most important lessons, and unfortunately, we've repeated many of our mistakes. But I think what we've been talking about today has given us an opportunity to at least address some of the worst aspects of the war, which was a catastrophe for both countries and a real atrocity for Vietnam. I mean, no family was unscathed by what happened there. And I think that all of us who lived through that time have felt a particular responsibility to try to address what happened in ways that we can, albeit many years later. And we can't solve those problems. We can't rewrite history, and ultimately we want the Vietnamese to be able to carry on these programs themselves. Part of our job is to, as I think Craig mentioned, help build the capacity for that to happen. And we'd like to do a lot more than we have been able to so far, but we've come quite a distance, and it would be important to note the contribution of Charles Bailey, without whom we never would have gotten to square one on particularly the Agent Orange issue. So, I think there are many lessons of the Vietnam War. Certainly, we are asking ourselves many of those same questions as a result of our experience in Afghanistan. But at least we can feel that we've learned that there are ways to essentially make amends for things that happened, and in doing so, build a better relationship with a country that was once our enemy and now is, as Charles and Lê Kê Sung have pointed out in their book, is a real partner of ours. So we have learned some things. I wish we'd learned more.
Thank you for that response. And with that, we're going to bring our event to a close. I want to thank all our panelists so much, Craig, Tim, and Matthew, for being here, and of course, Congresswoman Spear. There was so many questions we were not able to get to, and we will do our best to provide responses to those on the event page for those of you who were not able to have your questions answered. And lastly, before we go, I just want to draw attention to the grassroots advocacy campaign that is live and has been posted in the chat box. Certainly, as we heard from Congresswoman Spear and from Tim, engaging with Congress is such a great way to continue to build on the momentum that has already been gained in terms of addressing war legacy issues. So it just takes a few minutes to drop a letter to your member of Congress. Just by providing a little bit of your information, you can tailor a letter specifically to your members of Congress to let them know that you want them to focus on war legacy issues, and for House members, you would like to see your representatives join the UXO Demining Caucus. So thanks again to our panelists. Thank you to the Stimson Center. Thank you to all the members of the War Legacies Working Group. And let's just keep spreading the word and raising awareness on these very important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.